Hello, my friends. Welcome back. Let's see what happens next. Chapter 41, The Tears of a King. Despereaux found the king in the peas room, sitting on his daughter's bed, clutching the tapestry of her life to his chest. He was weeping. Although weeping is really too small a word for the activity that the king had undertaken. Tears were cascading from his eyes. A small puddle had formed at his feet. I am not exaggerating. The king, it seemed, was intent on crying himself a river. Reader, have you ever seen a king cry? When the powerful are made weak, when they are revealed to be human, to have hearts, their diminishment is nothing short of terrifying. You can be sure that Despereaux is terrified. Absolutely, but he spoke up anyway. "Sir," said the mouse to the king, but the king did not hear him. And as Despereaux watched, King Philip dropped the tapestry and took his great golden crown from his lap and used it to beat himself on the chest over and over again. The king, as I have already mentioned, had several faults. He was nearsighted. He made ridiculous, unreasonable, difficult to enforce laws, and much in the way of Miggery-Sow, he was not exactly the sharpest knife in the drawer. But there was one extraordinary, wonderful, admirable thing about the king. He was a man who was able and willing to love with the whole of his heart. And just as he had loved the queen with the whole of his heart, so too he loved his daughter with the whole of it, even more than the whole. He loved the Princess Pea with every particle of his being, and she had been taken from him. But what Despereaux had come to say to the king had to be said, so he tried again. "Excuse me," he said. He wasn't certain exactly how a mouse should address a king. Sir did not seem a big enough word. Despereaux thought about it for a long moment. He cleared his throat. He spoke as loudly as he was capable of speaking. "Excuse me, most very honored head person." King Philip stopped beating his crown against his chest. He looked around the room. "Down here, most very honored head person," said Despereaux. The king, tears still falling from his eyes, looked at the floor. He squinted. "Is that a bug speaking to me?" he asked. "No," said Despereaux. "I am a mouse. We met before." "A mouse?" bellowed the king. "A mouse is but one step removed from a rat." "Sir," said Despereaux, "most very honored head person, please, you have to listen to me. This is important. I know where your daughter is." "You do?" said the king. He sniffed. He blew his nose on his royal cloak. "Where?" he said, and as he bent over to look more closely at Despereaux, 1 tear, 2 tears, 3 enormous king-sized tears fell with an audible plop onto Despereaux's head and rolled down his back, washing away the white of the flower and revealing his own brown fur. "Sir, most very honored head person, sir," said Despereaux as he wiped the king's tears out of his own eyes, "she's in the dungeon." "Liar!" said the king. He sat back up. "I knew it. All rodents are liars and thieves. She is not in the dungeon. My men have searched the dungeon." "But no one really knows the dungeon except the rats, sir. There are thousands of places where she could be hidden, and only the rats would know. Your men would never be able to find her if the rats did not want her to be found." "Ah!" said the king, and he clapped his hands over his ears. "Do not speak to me of rats and what they know," he shouted. "Rats are illegal. Rats are against the law. There are no rats in my kingdom. They do not exist." "Sir, most very honored head person, that is not true. Hundreds of rats live in the dungeon of this castle. One of them has taken your daughter, and if you will send—" The king started humming. "I can't hear you." He stopped to shout, "I can't hear you! And anyway, what you say is wrong, because you are a rodent, and therefore a liar. I have hired fortune tellers. I have hired a magician. They are coming from a distant land. They will tell me where my beautiful daughter is. They will speak the truth. A mouse cannot speak the truth." "I am telling you the truth," said Despereaux. "I promise." But the king would not listen. He sat with his hands over his ears. He hummed loudly. Big, fat tears rolled down his face and fell to the floor. Despereaux sat and stared at him in dismay. What should he do now? He put a nervous paw up to his neck and pulled at the red thread, and suddenly his dream came flooding back to him. The dark and the light, the knight swinging his sword, and the terrible moment when he had realized that the suit of armor was empty. And then, reader, as he stood before the king, a wonderful, amazing thought occurred to the mouse. What if the suit of armor was empty for a reason? What if it had been empty because it was waiting for him? You know me. That's what the knight in his dream had said. Yes, said Despereaux out loud in wonder. I do know you. I can't hear you, said the king. I'll have to do it myself, said the mouse. I will be the knight in shining armor. There is no other way. It has to be me. Despereaux turned. He left the weeping king. He went to find the Threadmaster. Chapter 42. The Rest of the Thread. The Threadmaster was sitting atop his spool of thread, swinging his tail back and forth and eating a piece of celery. Well, look here, he said when he saw Despereaux. Wouldn't you just look at that? It's the mouse who loved a human princess back from the dungeon in one piece. The old Threadmaster would say that I didn't do my job well, that because you are still alive, I must have tied the thread incorrectly. But it is not so. And how do I know it is not so? Because the thread is still tied around your neck. He nodded and took a bite of celery. I need the rest of it, said Despereaux. The rest of what? Your neck? The rest of the thread. Well, I can't just hand it over to any old mouse, said the Threadmaster. They say red thread is special, sacred, though I, myself, after having spent so much time with it, know it for what it is. What is it? Asked Despereaux. Thread, said the Threadmaster. He shrugged and took another loud bite of celery. Nothing more, nothing less, but I pretend, Fred. I pretend. And what, may I ask, do you intend to do with the thread? Save the princess. Ah, yes, the princess, the beautiful princess. That's how this whole story started, isn't it? I have to save her. There's no one but me to do it. It seems to be that way with most things. No one to do the really disagreeable jobs except oneself. And how, exactly, will you use a spool of thread to save a princess? A rat has taken her and hidden her in the dungeon. So I have to go back to the dungeon, and it is full of twists and turns and hidden chambers. Like a maze, said the Threadmaster. Yes, like a maze. And I have to find my way to her wherever she is hidden, and then I have to lead her back out again. And there is only one day. The only way to do that is with the thread. Gregory the jailer tied a rope around his ankle so that he would not get lost. As the mouse said this, he shuddered, thinking of Gregory and his broken rope, dying, lost in the darkness. I, said Despereaux, I will use thread. The Threadmaster nodded. I see, he said. He took a meditative bite of celery. You, friend, are on a quest. I don't know what that is, said Despereaux. You don't have to know. You just have to feel compelled to do the thing, the impossible, important task at hand. Impossible? Said Despereaux. Impossible, said the Threadmaster. Important. He sat chewing his celery and staring somewhere past Despereaux, who then suddenly leaped off his spool. Who am I to stand in the way of a quest, he said. Roll her away. I can have it? Yes, for your quest. Despereaux put his front paws up and touched the spool. He gave an experimental push forward. Thank you, he said, looking into the eye of the Threadmaster. I don't know your name. Hovis. Thank you, Hovis. There's something else, something that belongs with the thread. Hovis went into the corner and came back with a needle. You can use it for protection. Like a sword, said Despereaux, like a knight would have. Yes, said Hovis. He gnawed off a length of thread and used it to tie the needle around Despereaux's waist. Like so. Thank you, Hovis. And he put his right shoulder against the spool of thread and pushed it forward again. Wait, said Hovis. And he stood up on his hind legs and put his paws on Despereaux's shoulder and leaned in close to him. Despereaux smelled the sharp, clean scent of celery as the Threadmaster bent his head and took hold of the thread around Despereaux's neck in his sharp teeth and pulled on it hard. There, said Hovis, when the piece of thread broke and dropped off to the ground. Now you're free. You see, you're not going into the dungeon because you have to. You're going because you choose to.
Yes, said Despereaux, because I am on a quest.
The word felt good and right in his mouth. Quest. Say it, reader. Say the word quest out loud. It is an extraordinary word, isn't it? So small and yet so full of wonder, so full of hope. Goodbye, said Hovis, as Despereaux pushed the spool of thread out of the threadmaster's hole. I have never known a mouse who had made it out of the dungeon only to go back in again. Goodbye, friend. Goodbye, mouse among mice. And here is a picture. Chapter 43. What Cook was stirring. That night, Despereaux rolled the thread from the threadmaster's lair, along innumerable hallways and down 3 flights of stairs. Reader, allow me to put this in perspective for you. Your average house mouse, or castle mouse, if you will, weighs somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 ounces. Despereaux, as you well know, was in no way average. In fact, he was so incredibly small that he weighed about half of what the average mouse weighs, 2 ounces. That is all. Think about it. He was nothing but 2 ounces of mouse, pushing a spool of thread that weighed almost as much as he did. Honestly, reader, what do you think the chances are of such a small mouse succeeding in his quest? Zip. 0. Nada. Goose eggs. But you must, when you are calculating the odds of the mouse's success, factor in his love for the princess. Love, as we have already discussed, is a powerful, wonderful, ridiculous thing, capable of moving mountains and spools of thread. Even with the love and the purpose in his heart, Despereaux was very, very tired when he reached the door to the castle kitchen at midnight. His paws were shaking, and his muscles were jumping, and the place where his tail should be was throbbing. And he still had a very, very long way to go, into the kitchen and down the many stairs of the dungeon, and then through, somehow, some way through the rat-filled darkness of the dungeon itself, not knowing where he was going. Oh, reader, when he stopped to consider what lay ahead of him, Despereaux was filled with an icky feeling of despair. He leaned his head against the spool of thread, and he smelled celery there, and he thought of Hovis and how Hovis seemed to believe in him in his quest. So the mouse raised his head and squared his shoulders and pushed the spool of thread forward again into the kitchen, where he saw too late that there was a light burning. Despereaux froze. Cook was in the kitchen. She was bent over the stove. She was stirring something. Was it a sauce? No. Was it a stew? No. What Cook was stirring was soup. Soup, reader! In the king's own castle, against the king's law, right under the king's very nose, Cook was making soup. As the mouse looked on, Cook put her face into the steam rising from the pot and took a deep breath. She smiled a beatific smile, and the steam rose around her and caught the light of the candle and made a halo over her head. Despereaux knew how Cook felt about mice in her kitchen. He remembered quite clearly her instructions to Mig regarding himself. Kill him. The only good mouse is a dead mouse. But he had to go through Cook's kitchen to get to the dungeon door. And he had no time to waste. Soon daylight would dawn, and the whole castle would be awake, and a mouse would have no chance at all of pushing a spool of thread across the floor without attracting a great deal of attention. He would have to sneak past the mouse-hating Cook now. And so, screwing up his courage to the sticking place, Despereaux leaned against the spool of thread and set it rolling across the floor. Cook turned from the stove, a dripping spoon in her hand, a frightened look on her face, and shouted, "Who's there?" We'll have to find out what happens next time.